So what happens is a self-directed process, about 90%. And once you understand the problem and the nature of the solutions, you have to do it sequentially. You just can't go from chronic pain to a free life without understanding the steps. So just one example is that, for instance, you have to give up anger to be pain-free. You cannot have anger. Means your nervous system is really fired up, hyperactive nervous system. Your nerve conductions increase, your body chemistry is off, you don't feel good. So processing anger is a huge deal. Not just forgiveness. Again, there's the input, the nervous system, and the output. So for processing anger, you work on all three. So once you learn these skills, just like an athlete learning a skill with repetition, it eventually becomes automatic.
Welcome to Beyond Theory, a podcast powered by Meadows Behavioral Healthcare that brings you in-depth conversations with firsthand insights from the front lines of mental health and addiction recovery. I'm Dominic Lawson. In 2019, over 20% of adults had chronic pain, and 7.4% of adults reported chronic pain that frequently limited life or work activities in the past 3 months, according to the CDC. Today, we talk to spinal surgeon David Hanscom about ways to solve your chronic pain with or without surgery. Let's get out of the abstract and see how this applies in the real world. It's time to go beyond theory.
I'm David Hanscom. I'm an orthopedic spine surgeon.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on the Beyond Theory podcast, Dr. Hanscom. We actually had someone suggest you from last season to come on the show. So we're so grateful for your time today. If you would, just kind of share your background, if you would.
I practiced complex spine surgery in Seattle, Washington for over 30 years. I did spend 4 years in Sun Valley where I learned a lot about chronic pain. I also suffered from chronic pain for over 15 years. And I didn't know how it hit me. I didn't know what to do about it. I'm a physician, of course, so I had all sorts of resources, and nobody could tell me the problem. So in one day, I was driving across a bridge in Seattle, the Lake Washington Bridge, and I had a panic attack. And prior to that point in time, being a major spine surgeon, I had suppressed anxiety. I did not know what anxiety was. And so I went from no anxiety to a panic attack, which is racing heart. You feel like you're going to faint. Your muscles are tight. You get short of breath and just extreme anxiety. And for the next 15 years, I could not put that anxiety back into the bottle. So it's been quite a ride.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. If you would, how did that chronic pain affect your personal life, like yourself, your family, and the whole nine?
Destroyed it. And there's over 100 million people in the United States with chronic pain, with 25% of that being really incredibly disabling, maybe higher. I think it's really hard statistic to get a handle on. They keep quoting a number of $600 billion a year, which I think is low. But the bottom line is it destroys everything. And there's 2 research papers that document that suffering from chronic pain has the same impact on your life as having terminal cancer, except it's worse. So at terminal cancer, you at least know what the diagnosis is. With chronic pain, you don't. With cancer, there's an endpoint, positive or negative, but you're dealing with certainty. With chronic pain, you have no endpoint. Nobody's telling you what the diagnosis is. Nobody's giving you any hope of getting out of it. Nobody knows what the endpoint is. So the anxiety created just by that uncertainty is just brutal.
Absolutely. And in your book, Back in Control, you talk about this and more. You know, one of the things you talk about is trying to find the source of chronic pain, which is quite difficult. Can you elaborate on that?
It doesn't matter where the source comes from.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a broken bone, could be a ruptured disc, it could be muscle pain, could be headaches. So what happens with chronic pain? First of all, when I say chronic pain, there's over 30 different types of chronic pain. Again, migraines, tinnitus, ringing in the ear, skin rashes, stomach issues. That's all chronic disease. So I'm trying to change the terminology now to chronic disease. It turns out that every chronic disease has a common source, and that's inflammation. So when your body's under threat of any kind, stress from work, your thoughts, physical threats, relationships, all those threats that are sustained fire up your body's fight or flight. Well, that also includes your immune system, which is inflammatory. It also cranks up your body's consumption of energy that we call metabolism. So when you have a chronically elevated inflammatory state and metabolic state, it's like driving your car down the freeway in second gear. It's going too fast for too long and it starts to break down. So we know, for instance, in people in chronic pain end up having a shortened lifespan of about 7 years compared to the average person. So the effects of this chronic, so I'm going to say one quick comment, which is a whole different podcast, but it turns out this word anxiety is the pain. In other words, anxiety is the result of a threat, not the cause. So if something threatens you, your body has adrenaline, cortisol, what's called inflammatory cytokines, which are small proteins that fire up the immune system. So your body's on high alert. You feel what? Anxious.
Right.
Just like you're lying on the beach in the sun, you feel relaxed. So anxiety is just a word that describes your neurochemical state. That's it. So it's the result of a threat. It's not the cause.
Gotcha. Thank you for sharing that. And you mentioned this in your book about negative thoughts kind of fueling that chronic pain. Can you talk about that a little bit more, if you don't mind? Because I thought that was an interesting part of your book.
Well, I'm convinced that is the essence of chronic pain, is human consciousness.
Right.
Because thoughts and emotions have now been documented to have the same impact on your pain, impact on your nervous system as a physical threat. So what happens, it goes to the same part of the brain, whether it's emotional pain, negative thoughts, or physical threat. It goes to the same region of the brain, and you have the same chemical response. So the problems that humans have, which is the curse, I call it the curse of consciousness, is that you cannot escape your thoughts and emotions. But what's even more frustrating is that repressed thoughts and emotions are more damaging than expressed thoughts and emotions. So since no human being can really escape their consciousness, then your body is always under some degree of chemical assault. So if this thoughts are sort of bothersome and not a big deal, or just normal anxiety, no big deal. But a lot of people, especially in today's society, are bombarded with sensory input. They're stressed, they're frustrated. Well, that's a physiological problem. When you're feeling stressed and frustrated, it's your body's chemistry has changed. You have an adverse physiology. So the threat physiology, the fight or flight, is necessary to escape danger, but it's not intended to be sustained. That's the problem. But a bigger part of the issue is that this unconscious survival response is the unconscious brain processes about 20 million bits of information per second. The conscious brain processes 40. 20 million versus 40, that's a big difference. So you have this thing called anxiety that I'm going to call an activated nervous system. Let's get rid of the word anxiety. And when you can solve the problem, the nervous system calms down and you go on with your life. When you can't solve the problem, such as escaping your thoughts and emotions, you become more activated or hyperactivated and you become angry. We're going to get rid of the word anger also, because it's a hyperactivated nervous system. What happens in chronic pain is that your nervous system gets disconnected to the cues, and it just goes all over the map. And we call it a dysregulated nervous system. So the key issue is that you cannot control your thoughts or emotions. Repressed thoughts and emotions are more of a threat than expressed thoughts and emotions. So what do you do?
Gotcha. Thank you for sharing that. In that same vein, I imagine that's even more so due to COVID. What have you seen when it comes to that? Have you seen more cases of chronic pain with patients because of COVID, because of the negative thoughts and stressors?
Absolutely, but it's a little bit more complicated than that.
For sure.
Well, so first of all, remember the first thing that causes an activated nervous system is uncertainty. Right?
Right.
You don't know who your friends are or aren't. Your normal friends who are your friends, they come over to your house. Maybe they are not so safe anymore because they might have COVID, right? So you have a factor of anxiety right there. Then you have the uncertainty of the length of the epidemic, whether it's going to end or not. Is the vaccine going to work or not? Is there going to be a variant coming aboard? So uncertainty is probably the most powerful way to fire up the nervous system, to activate your nervous system. And when I say activate the nervous system, I mean the body's physiology. And so then the other thing is called co-regulation, that humans evolved by getting along with other humans. Social connection, cooperation is how we survive. So we have a desperate need for human connection. Of course, in COVID, that was really disrupted with the mask and also the isolation. So Dr. Stephen Porges wrote a book called The Polyvagal Theory. And he points out that humans co-regulate. In other words, I talk to you, you seem like a nice guy, I can relax, right? Maybe right. I'm a surgeon, so I'm still a nice guy, not that bad.
Right.
So you co-regulate. You smile, you don't smile, you frown, you don't frown. So it's all modulated through the vagus nerve connected to the facial muscles. So if you're smiling and relax, my vagus nerve kicks into gear that says you're safe, I can relax. But the vagus nerve is very powerfully anti-inflammatory. If I perceive you as danger, my sympathetic nervous system kicks into gear, and it's adrenaline, cortisol, inflammatory proteins called cytokines. My metabolism goes up. So what happens in the COVID epidemic, we've lost our cues of safety. We don't co-regulate when we don't see each other.
Gotcha. Thank you for sharing that. So we've talked about the issue. Let's talk about the solutions now, because what does that look like as far as the road to recovery from chronic pain? I know in your book you talk about 5 steps. Kind of talk about that a little bit.
Well, I'm going to rephrase that a little bit and hopefully simplify it. So there's 3 parts of staying alive.
Okay.
There's your stresses or your environment or your circumstances, right? Then you have your nervous system with all these sensors, vision, feel, touch, that are processed in the environment. Then your brain directs traffic to act in a way that keeps you alive. So you have the input, the nervous system, and the output. So the goal is you want your output or your neurochemical state to be either neutral or safe. In those situations, when you're safe, you regenerate. Neutral is what it is. Then threat is needed to take care of yourself, but you do not want it to be sustained. You're draining your energy. So at the end of the day, what the goal is to be in a state of safety or neutral. You can calm that down. For instance, just drop your shoulders for a second, take a deep breath, let it out, and just slow breathing directly stimulates the vagus nerve. Breathing through your nose stimulates the vagus nerve. Humming stimulates the 7th cranial nerve, which is close to the vagus nerve, which is anti-inflammatory. So the ways of directly taking you from a threat state into a neutral or safe state, those are direct means. There's the nervous system. So remember, if your nervous system is hyperactive, it takes less stress to set off that threat state, right?
Right.
So what you're doing, again, your goal is to keep your body in safe or neutral. So if your nervous system is fired up, for instance, lack of sleep, sleep is huge. Sleep is actually the first thing we work on in solving chronic pain.
Right.
It's been shown that lack of sleep is actually more of a prognostic factor for disability than the pain. We also found that lack of sleep actually causes chronic low back pain. It's not the other way around. So if you're not sleeping, the rest of the project is null and void, except, of course, the other tools help you sleep. But you have to sleep. Exercise. You know what the number 1 risk factor for dying from COVID is? Number 1. More than obesity, hypertension, lung disease, heart disease. Number 1. You know what it is?
What is it?
Lack of exercise. And again, exercise is anti-inflammatory. So it is shocking that the paper just came across my desk 2 weeks ago, and I've written a couple papers on COVID, and exercise is huge. So again, it's the state of your nervous system. Then the input. So you can complain, gossip, whatever you want to do that keeps your nervous system fired up. We ask people not to discuss their medical care, because that, again, fires things up. So complaining, gossiping, being critical, giving advice that is not asked for is all negative input. Forgiveness. Forgiveness changes the input. In other words, what are you putting into your brain and what are you choosing to hold on to? So not watching the news is a big factor in calming down that inflammatory response. There's actually a paper out of Australia that shows that watching TV actually causes inflammation and increases mortality, period. Doesn't matter what you watch.
Wow.
That the higher number of hours of TV you watch per day increases your mortality, period. So you have exercise being a factor in solving mortality, and then watching TV in addition to not exercising, you're actually inflaming your nervous system. So as far as practical things to do, I say, look, there's a process called expressive writing, where you simply write down your thoughts and tear them up. And what happens is that for some reason, it's not the solution, but it's been shown in 1,200 research papers to be the one necessary step that breaks into this consciousness train of thought So you can't control your thoughts and emotions, but you can separate from them. So with writing, you've written down your thoughts and emotions. You've now separated, and you tear them up. You tear them up for two reasons. One is to write with freedom. The more free you're writing, the better. Totally free. The second thing is when you write, all these issues come up. They're not issues. They're just thoughts. So what happens is that our thoughts do become a version of reality. These thoughts go on paper, you want to analyze them and fix them. Well, the problem is your attention's on the thoughts and you're analyzing them and reinforcing them. So expressive writing is the first starting step. Second thing is called active meditation, where you just simply switch your brain from racing thoughts to sensory input. So again, just drop your shoulders and just listen to a sound for a few seconds. That's it.
Gotcha.
So instead of fighting with the thought, you simply switch your attention elsewhere. The next thing is sleep, which we just discussed.
Right.
And the last one we discussed briefly is don't talk about your pain, mental or physical. No complaining. Don't discuss your medical care with anybody except your doctors, period. So again, you're reinforcing the circuit. So at the end of the day, those are just the starting points.
Of course.
So at the end of the day, what you're doing, the way you solve first of all, chronic pain is solvable. We look at it as something to be managed. And again, I want to say the word chronic disease more than chronic pain. Of course, chronic pain is one of those diseases, but chronic pain is solvable. And what you're doing, you're creating a new set of circuits in your brain that don't have pain. It's called neuroplasticity. So the three parts of that are awareness, separation, and then redirecting. So again, the most basic tool is expressive writing. You have awareness and separation. You have to be aware of what the thoughts are before you can switch directions. So the writing gives you the thoughts on the table. You're here. You have awareness and separation in one step. Then again, just feel the back of your chair for a second. And redirecting is sensory input or play or giving back or listening to good music. If you're listening to music to distract yourself without doing the first two steps of awareness and separation, it doesn't work. So neuroplasticity is a big deal. Then using the ways to drop down your reactivity or actually drop down the actual chemical response, between neuroplasticity and learning the tools, it's a huge difference. And by the way, this is again a different conversation, but the tipping point in chronic pain, by the way, I'm going to use the anger word one more time, is a hyperactivated nervous system.
Gotcha.
So when you learn the skills to process anger, that's always a tipping point to true healing. I did put together a program called the DLC Journey, called the Direct Your Own Care Journey. You can find it on the internet very quickly. Mm-hmm. And we've had hundreds of patients go to pain-free. When I say pain-free, it means you can solve it, you're free. Life always comes at you, of course. But in general, they've broken loose. They're free. They thrive. So what happens is a self-directed process, about 90%. And once you understand the problem and the nature of the solutions, you have to do it sequentially. You just can't go from chronic pain to a free life without understanding the steps. So just one example is that, for instance, you have to give up anger to be pain-free. You cannot have anger means your nervous system is really fired up, hyperactive nervous system. Your nerve conductions increase, your body chemistry is off, you don't feel good. So processing anger is a huge deal. Not just forgiveness. Again, there's the input, the nervous system, and the output. So for processing anger, you work on all three. So once you learn these skills, just like an athlete learning a skill with repetition,
right,
it eventually becomes automatic. So our brain's trained to survive. That's the automatic survival, right? So with repetition, that process becomes very strong as you get older. In fact, anxiety gets worse as you get older. So does anger and frustration, because it's a programming issue. So you become a genius at feeling pain. So what you want to do is become a genius at feeling good. So positive thinking doesn't do that because you are suppressing. So it's awareness, separation, then redirecting. And with repetition, your brain automatically goes to this new spot.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. When you was talking about expressive writing, I was thinking about here at the Meadows that we have equine therapy and art rooms that allow us to kind of redirect that attention like you talked about. So I appreciate you sharing that. In your book and in many of your speeches and things of that nature, you often talk about being isolated.
Right.
Can fuels that chronic pain as well. Kind of talk about that a little bit.
We just heard a lecture last week from a Dr. Steve Cole out of UCLA, and what we find out that there are societal threats that directly go to the DNA, and they express these. He calls them warrior white cells. In other words, there's these white cells that just destroy everything. The number one factor that causes that to happen is social isolation. So social isolation directly stimulates your genome or the genetic DNA to produce these warrior white cells that are just flat out destructive. We also know that in social isolation, you develop the same symptoms as in chronic pain. It's the same entity. So again, mental pain and physical pain are processed the same way. Mental pain is the bigger problem because you can't escape your thoughts and emotions. And then again, the way we evolved is social connection. So social isolation is deadly as far as threat. You don't have a support system. You're not interacting with other people. You get to think about your pain even more, which strengthens those circuits. So it's a tricky deal because you're in chronic pain, you're angry, you're frustrated, you have a hard time reaching out. Yet at the same time, reaching out and interacting in a positive way, again, not discussing your pain, is part of healing. So that's why the sequencing is so critical, because you have to start feeling enough energy to reach out and talk to other people.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Now, you speak often about stories of success. Just talk about, David, if you would, that peace of mind that you have as a clinician, but also that peace of mind that you're giving people that read your book, that hear you speak, and everything else.
Yeah, it's inspiring. I mean, I was so inspired by people's resilience and persistence, I can't even tell you. I have one gentleman who had 28 surgeries in 22 years. He's fine. He's been fine for 6 years. Another woman who she's 55 years of chronic pain. She's now been pain-free for 6 years. I had another young girl who came to our workshop. She was 32 at the time. She had neck pain for 4 years. She has seen 10 doctors in New York. She has 6 injections, high-dose narcotics, and within 1 week, she was pain-free. And 7 years later, she has 2 beautiful kids. She has no pain, and she is absolutely thriving. So what happens when you don't have to keep fighting anxiety and frustration, then you're free to live your life at a level you didn't know existed before. Like, for instance, this guy had 28 surgeries in 22 years. I did not think that was possible. He keeps telling me that I never felt better my entire life, ever. Okay. I mean, it's hard to believe. I mean, it's so inspiring. People are so excited. And of course, it's energizing. We talk about co-regulation. It goes both ways. If somebody's excited, you get excited.
For sure.
So I have a lot of passion on the project. But again, this young girl, 32 years old, if we hadn't run across each other, she, 7 years later would probably be in high-dose narcotics, probably had 1 or 2 neck surgeries. People's lives get destroyed. So again, see, so many people thrive at such a high level. It's about 90% self-directed, requires minimal resources, and is incredibly inspiring and energizing.
For sure. Thank you so much for sharing that. We have many aspiring clinicians that listen to the Beyond Theory podcast, David. If you would just kind of give them some words of advice, especially as they go out and pursue their endeavors. But also, I know you speak a lot in the media outlets and stuff like that. What are some words of advice you can give clinicians that speak to the media and things like that?
Well, the main thing is that you want to help your patients create a sense of safety.
Gotcha.
But you're not going to make your patients feel any safer with you than you feel with yourself. Right? Mm-hmm. Can't do it. You can think you're doing it, but right now the burnout rate amongst physicians is about 70%. So we've taken many clinicians through the doc journey or something like that. And so I'd strongly recommend that physicians are working very hard. We don't have time with the patients. We don't have time for ourselves, that you have to take care of yourself. You're not going to be very effective as a clinician. And then it goes both ways. Once you can connect with yourself, you start connecting with your patients. Medicine, by the way, is sort of tedious. People don't understand this. So there's about 10 things we do regularly: medications, physical therapy, surgery, injections, etc. Right? You do that for years, day after day after day. That's not very interesting after a while. But what makes medicine incredibly interesting is the patients. They are infinitely different. They have their issues. And so we actually go to the issues as opposed to just giving them medication. It's a huge difference. So let me just give you one example, just classic one. I had a gentleman who was about 70 years old. He came to my office with his wife and daughter, and he had chronic neck pain for about 5 years. So I said to my fellow, I said, look, this doesn't take much time. It's not very hard. I just ask a simple question, what's going on? I said, sometimes when you're under stress, while your body chemistry is off and you feel pain when you normally would not feel pain. So the end of the story is his grandson was a paranoid schizophrenic who had shot his father, who is his son. That's the diagnosis. It's not neck pain. So by taking 5 minutes just to listen to the guy's story, that's the diagnosis. Now, I don't know what happened eventually, but with all my patients that heal, you don't want to try to solve the story because it's a huge loss, but you do want to give them the tools to process it. So that's the diagnosis. It helps people to find out what's going on and help them to move on. It's much more satisfying and energizing than just going through the motions of dosing out medications, et cetera.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Just 2 more questions here on the Beyond Theory podcast, David. Really appreciate your time here. We'd like to ask a fun fact of all of our guests. I know you are an avid ping pong player. What's a fun fact people don't really know about you?
Well, I used to write poetry. Okay. And for about 3 years, when I was going through my chronic pain, by the way, I could not stop writing poetry. Mm-hmm. And then when I get back into practice and my wife gives me a hard time about this, the poetry stopped. So anyway, I know it's in there and I can't force it out, but it was an interesting phase of my life that I never remotely thought I could write poetry.
Interesting. I guess that explains the expressive writing you were speaking of earlier.
Maybe. Yeah, that's a good point.
Absolutely. Absolutely appreciate that. And lastly, is there another resource or book besides your book, David, that people should be aware of and should check out?
So there's a friend of mine, Les Aria.
Okay.
We're on Facebook Live every weekday morning at 7:00. I'm Dr. David Hanscom. And Dr. Aria is a wonderful somatic psychologist. And he has a group called remedypain.co. Remedypain.co. He does coaching, a nice set of resources. And we feel like my work does a lot of foundational work. He's able to take people into a different dimension, which is wonderful. So that's one resource I would suggest.
Dr. Hanscom is an orthopedic complex spinal deformity surgeon based in Seattle, Washington. For more than 3 decades, he teaches people how to break loose from the grip of chronic mental and physical pain, with and without surgery. Find out more at backendcontrol.com. Beyond Theory is produced and hosted by me, Dominic Lawson. You can discover more, including videos of some of our conversations, at beyondtheory.com. For more information on Meadows Behavioral Healthcare, go to meadowsbh.com. Finally, thank you for listening, and I hope you join us next time for another episode of Beyond Theory.